Hello, friends. My name is Gabriel Said Reynolds. I'm in my office at the University of Notre Dame, even wearing my Notre Dame theology t-shirt. There you go. Here, I will tell you all about my new book. Let's see if I can get it to show properly. Christianity and the Quran from Yale University Press, with all sorts of blurbs from really serious scholars there on the back to tell you that, there's something in there that might intrigue you to read it. The title of the book is Christianity and the Quran. In this presentation, I'm going to briefly present the four main units of the book and put it all together with this argument that Christianity was much more formative in the emergence of the Quran and of Islam than generations of scholars have dared to believe. Yeah, let me see if I can at least intrigue you, if not convince you of this basic argument. I want to start by just affirming what I am not arguing, because there's already buzz around this book and folks saying, "Oh, Reynolds is saying this or that." In fact, I am not saying that the Quran is actually a Christian book and has a Christian message. If anything, I'm saying that the Quran is a response to an argument against Christianity. I am not saying that Muslim scholars misunderstood the Quran, didn't understand its vocabulary, or something like that. What I'm getting at is really the world behind the Quran and signs in the Quran about the way that the author is engaging with that world. And I am not saying that everything about Mecca and Medina is a myth. Islam really began somewhere further to the north in Palestine or Syria or someplace like that. So what am I arguing? That's what I'm arguing. That Christianity is a conversation partner, in fact, the principal conversation partner of the Quran. I'm going to sort of present the way the argument works in four steps, just starting with like, what have scholars, historical critical scholars said about the Quran's relationship with Christianity before? Where are there clear, explicit indications of Christianity and some implicit references to Christianity in the Quran? What do we know now, especially in light of the super exciting work done by archaeologists and people studying inscriptions or epigraphy in Arabia, that is, modern day Saudi Arabia, Yemen, into the north, places like Jordan as well. How does that help us understand what Christianity was like at the dawn of Islam? And then finally, how is the Quran developing its own theology and really prophetology in conversation with Christianity? So let's start with the traditional ideas, and you can sort of read through that quotation from the Scottish Orientalist, early scholar Richard Bell. And that sort of sums up like the general take of most really most scholars, even up to the 21st century, working within a critical sort of academic context, basically that Arabia was sort of insulated from the great Christian civilizations of the late antique Middle East. It was something like a pagan island within a Christian sea. Part of that that's alluded to in the quotation is that so far we have no evidence, at least unambiguous evidence, that the Bible had been translated into Arabic before Islam. So that might be maybe one argument that Christianity had not really become robust among Arabic speakers. But if you made that argument, you'd be wrong. Okay, let me just give you like another way in which earlier scholars sort of thought about Christianity in the Quran, and that was to go to some of the books in my background here. So some of the traditional Arabic Islamic biographies of the Prophet filled with different narrations. And in those narrations, you find allusions to, Christians here or there. Christian kind of wandered through Mecca, or a small group of Christians, maybe from Southern Arabia, happened to, go on a delegation for a couple of days to Medina. It might have been Christians across the Red Sea in Ethiopia. Some Muslims visited them, but everything was basically sporadic. I mean, the first sort of significant account for people who work this way is the account of the Prophet Muhammad's first revelation or experience of revelation when he's meditating on Mount Hira outside of Mecca. And, he's seeking sort of guidance and mentorship in thinking through this experience. And he turns first to his first wife, Khadija, and she affirms him, but also speaks to her cousin Warqa, and you can see from this report in the traditional biography of Ibn Ishaq that Warqa is described as a Christian who had read the scriptures and learned from people who followed the Torah and the gospel. So, Warqa then would seem to be sort of one Christian who was around. Of course, he affirms Muhammad. And so, there could have been individual Christians like Warqa here and there. And then people tend to sort of extrapolate from those kinds of narrations of, oh, one Christian here, one Christian there, a few Christians passing through, to what might have been for someone like Bell, like a real historical situation, which is, Mecca, it was also a center for trade. So there could have been camel riders, Arabia, camels, that kind of way of thinking, that kind of vibe. They're wandering through. Some of them might have been Christian, going from Syria down to Yemen, passing through Mecca, maybe all the way, hoping to get a boat to India or something like that. And, Bell, just to, not to pick on Richard Bell, he's actually been picked on quite a bit, but in part because he wrote a lot. So it's a good way to sort of establish a foundation of earlier ideas. Here he speaks of the Prophet Muhammad himself and says, listen, because it seems like there was no Arabic Bible, he would not have any direct access to the particular data of Christian revelation. And so look at the second sentence, he probably assumed that that is Christianity, was simply the natural religion which he himself had reached. It's actually very interesting that Bell thinks through things that way and seems to argue that the Prophet Muhammad had a natural religion that is no true supernatural revelation, but maybe through the voice of his conscience or observation of the world, came to some basic teachings about God through nature. So, that's kind of the normal take. Some people add to this that, there are reports like of Hanifs and things in these Islamic sources, which suggests there was this kind of community which would have which had a sort of primitive monotheism, again, a kind of natural religion, rejecting the paganism of the folks in Mecca, but not having the benefit of a supernatural religion like Christianity or Judaism. And so, from this way of thinking, the Arabs were kind of on their way. Maybe Muhammad himself was one of these Hanifs, and all these, Hanifs, they were on their way towards becoming kind of people of the book. And, scholars would say, well, there's also evidence in the Qur'an itself, because the opponents in Meccan surahs like Al-Ankabut, Surah 29, the opponents of the prophets seem to be theists. They seem to believe in God or Allah. So you see that, 29:61, another case there in Quran 31, who created the heavens and the earth? They will say Allah, God. So that would be a sign that, they were on their way, they were maybe in between, like total depraved, polytheistic, idolatrous paganism, but they certainly wouldn't have been Christians. Okay, so now one thing to add to this mix, to this stew with lots of different ingredients here of how earlier scholars tended to think of the Quran and Christianity, is this notion that, well, probably if there were Christians, they would have been heretics, and I should record a separate video on this, but like the basic idea is that, well, the desert, it's far away from the central power of Byzantium and Constantinople, even from any of the major other cities like Damascus or Alexandria or whatever. And, that's a good place, one imagines, for heretics to sort of hang out. And then if you look at very early Christian sources like the heresiography of Epiphanius, there are reports that out there were Nazarenes or Judeo-Christians or something like that. When he says Arabia, he probably means modern-day Jordan, not, what is sometimes referred to as Arabia Deserta, so what is closer to what would be Saudi Arabia today. Anyway, I shouldn't go into details about that. I should stay focused, but it's just, this is a Protestant scholar. I think he was an American Spear, who was like, oh, poor Muhammad, if he had met real Christians, then things would have turned out better for him. Of course, this is Spear's perspective. But he only met, some sort of heretics out there in the desert of Arabia. Here's a very famous scholar, Hamilton Gibb, who, more or less says the same thing. There were none of the organized churches were there around Muhammad, but they were just kind of what folks call the heretical churches. Okay, this has not gone away. So I presented this as sort of earlier generations, although I alluded to the notion that it's still around today. And in the masterful work of Aziz al-Azmi, The Emergence of Islam in Late Antiquity, he basically defends this view. Um, he's certainly not simply repeating what earlier Orientalists say. I mean, he's a brilliant historian and engages with all sorts of sources, not just the Islamic sources, but has a robust view of the whole landscape of the Middle East and really of late antiquity across the Mediterranean Sea, further to the east in Africa, etc. But in the end, he does argue that the Hijaz, that is Western Arabia, the region of Mecca and Medina, was an anachronism. It was a leftover of pagan days. In terms of religious history, it was not contemporary with surrounding territories between which it was wedged. It was a pagan reservation. Even speaks later, although he clarifies what he means by this term of, if you see down here, being understood with respect to certain areas, retardation being understood in terms of the historical dynamics of Verzeitlichung. So, I mean, this notion that it's been historically delayed or retarded in a very literal meaning of that term, not in the pejorative sense, it's been held back into the world of paganism. And consequently, he sees a very sort of indirect connection between the Bible and the Quran. I do sort of like the idea of, in the second quotation here of Professor Lazme, that the Quran is more a Quranization of biblical things. And so therefore, the Quran sort of has this strong shaping instinct in the way that it engages with biblical tradition. So that part I agree with, and we'll get back to it. Okay, let's get on to part two, which is evidence for Christianity in the Quran. And I've started with this great image here. This is from a work of art by an American artist named Sandow Birk, who took a translation of the Quran, wrote it all out by hand, and then illustrated or illuminated his translation or his handwritten translation of the Quran. He's taken someone else's translation with scenes from American life in order to sort of send a message to Americans that Muslims are just as American as you are, but also to Muslims that Muslims in America, that, let's make Islam part of the American landscape, make an American Islam. Anyway, you don't have to agree or disagree with those arguments. I just think it's a cool piece of work because look at this. This is the story of the companions of the cave, American style. So imagine the Appalachians like a West Virginia coal mine, and seven of the miners are trapped in a cave with their dog. Look at Quran 18, verse 18. So yeah, pretty cool there. Okay, let's start then with biblical turns of phrase. I'll turn to narrations in a moment, but even if you start at a micro level, just short turns of phrase, there's a lot of biblical stuff in the Quran. So, for example, did you know that the Quran speaks of a camel passing through the eye of the needle in regard to folks who will find it very difficult to get into heaven? So, Quran 740, there you have it there. You could compare it with what we find in the Gospel of Matthew, hundreds of years earlier, but then was presumably part of the way that Christians would speak about stuff, as they do even today. Like Christians like to speak about this, it's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of the needle than a rich man to get into heaven. If they look at some, I don't know, tech billionaire or something and be like, yeah, he's gonna get his just desserts after death. Okay, so that's an important point, that these sorts of turns of phrase became a part, as they still are today, of Christian ways of speaking. There they are in the Quran. I mean, I've just mentioned one so far. There's a lot of these. I've written written about this in a couple of places, but I go into greater depth about this point in the new book. So there we go. So another one, circumcision of the heart. This is super interesting because the Quran does not, in juridical terms, speak about circumcision. Later Islamic fiqh jurisprudence does, but the Quran itself does not speak of circumcision as part of the Islamic legal code. But it does pick up on this very, very, very biblical metaphor that there's a spiritual circumcision, so there's a circumcision of the flesh, and then there's a spiritual circumcision, which is spoken of as circumcision of the heart. It's there twice in the Quran. It's really all over the Bible. It's in the Old Testament. It's in the New Testament. I've just given one example. This is Stephen's speech in front of the Sanhedrin in Acts chapter 7, where he accuses the Jews, or the Jews in the Sanhedrin, of being uncircumcised in hearts. And sure enough, in the Quran, guess who was accused? Actually, guess who was made to say, our hearts are uncircumcised? The Jews as well. So this presumably became among Christian communities who were speaking about, the Jews, and yeah, they boast that, they've held on to the circumcision of the flesh, but actually they're uncircumcised in their heart. This was a Christian way of sort of anti-Jewish rhetoric, and it finds its way in the Quran as well. More and more and more could be said. I mean, there's lots of here. The Quran speaks about a very small thing as a mustard seed. I mean, there are other small seeds or other small things. It does speak of a gnat in other places as well. But of all the seeds, why does it speak twice about a mustard seed? The Gospels have Jesus speak of the mustard seed as an example of the smallest thing, the kingdom of God, for example, which then becomes so great, like the tree that can be, what's the word? Can emerge from the mustard seed. The Quran speaks of the twinkling of the eye, which is used by Paul in 1 Corinthians, as the Quran does, or as Paul does. The Quran uses it in regard to the afterlife or the coming of the day of judgment. The Quran, when it speaks about forgiveness, it uses a nice round number of 70 times. Well, I mean, guess what Jesus does when he speaks about forgiveness? 70 times, not 60, not 80, 70. Okay, I mean, there are many, many, many of this. The heavens rolling up like scrolls. That's in the Quran. It's in Isaiah, and it's in the last book of the Christian Bible, the book of Revelation. There's a nice play with Hebrew, so this is important because it complicates things. It's not only sort of Christian languages, but this famous thing where we hear in Arabic that the Israelites are made to say Semi'ana wa asena. It sounds a lot like the Hebrew washmanu wa asinu, except that the meaning is the opposite. Now the Jews are not faithfully saying, we will do it, we heard and we will do it. Instead, now they're made to say, we heard and we will rebel against you. But the asena and the asinu, yeah, sounds really similar, just asena, asinu. Okay, many other ones are there, Quran 32. 2 points about these. They're overwhelmingly Christian. So the Hebrew bit we just spoke about is the exception which proves the rule. And another point is that they are used in new ways, which is key to the whole argument, because it shows that the Quranic author is not just copying stuff out of the Bible, but is naturally naturally integrating turns of phrase that were used in his own context. And it happens to be that those turns of phrase are Christian turns of phrase, right out of the New Testament, not only from the Gospels, but also from Paul's letters. And he naturally integrates them because they were used in his context, which suggests Christianity was there. I mean, if you get to larger stories, I mean, I have to do this pretty quickly, but the larger stories are also very, very profound and convincing evidence for Christianity's major presence in the context of the Quran's emergence. Quran, I think in 7 different occasions, tells the story of God commanding the angels to bow before Adam, and the angels all do except for one, and that's Iblis, or the devil, from Greek diabolos. And this story becomes what nerdy folks say is an etiology. It explains why the devil is out to get humans. I mean, the Iblis in the Quran says this explicitly. He says to God, because you have
deceived me, aghwaytani, I will go out and deceive them. So it's explicit in the Quran. This is, this is a Christian story. It's in accounts like the life of Adam and Eve. Yes, it had some Jewish roots, that story, but it was received in the Christian communities. And then the Cave of Treasures and other Christian accounts. And what the story does is explain why the devil is out to get humans. It gives that kind of background to the enmity of the devil for humans. And there it is in the Quran repeatedly. The Joseph story, has all of these differences from the canonical text of Genesis. It's at the very end of Genesis. In the Quranic version, there are all these differences. These differences, for example, the wolf, instead of a wild animal, very often reveal Christian sources in between Genesis and the Quran. The story of the sleepers already alluded to in regard to Sandalberg's artwork there. But here's an interesting point. The Quran has a dispute as to whether they are 7 or 8, or if you keep the dog there and count. It reflects in right after the telling of the story a debate that was going on in its context to exactly how many young men were sleeping in the cave. And we know from the different manuscript traditions of the sleepers of Ephesus story that some of them spoke of 7, some of them spoke of 8. So there was a dispute among Christian communities, even if the story later became known as the 7 sleepers of Ephesus. There really was a dispute. We know that from an independent source among Christians about how many sleepers there were. And then the Quran is seeking to resolve this dispute. I mean, it ultimately does so by saying, like, just trust God, stop fighting about it. Hope that point's clear, because it's super interesting. It shows, like, the Quran is engaging with lived Christian tradition. Also in Quran 18 is the story in the Quran of the two-horned one, the one with 2 horns, as Kevin Van Bladel and others like Tommaso Tese have shown. This Quranic version follows very closely Syriac Christian texts about Alexander. Again, this needs a whole separate video, but just keep in mind, yes, Alexander was a pagan who lived before Christ, but he is received in Christian tradition, not in the New Testament, but in later Christian tradition, after the Bible, before the Quran, as a sort of proto-Christian who anticipates Christianity, and he becomes like almost saintly, and in a special way is linked with the claims of certain Byzantine emperors. There he is in the Quran, not to advance Byzantine claims, but to advance the Quran's own claims about apocalyptic stuff, Gog and Magog and that sort of thing. But again, the Quran is engaging with this Christian story legend, which is not in the Bible, but is part of lived Christian culture at the time. So there we go. My animations are all messed up on the slide because I wanted to give you a quotation here on the sleepers. So this should have showed up right before the Alexander bit. I mean, just this is it shows you that the imagery which leads to a dog being present in the Companions of the Cave story, that dog is a direct result of the metaphor which Christians use to tell the story, which is the sleepers were like sheep, and their enemy was like a wolf, and the dog, protects the sheep from the wolf. That's why we have a dog in Quran 18. Okay, on to part 3. So halfway through, deep breath, keep going. So part 3 is about evidence that we have. So not looking at the Quran or the Bible or that kind of thing, but looking at material evidence from mostly recent work, not by me, by other scholars who do serious stuff, about the context of Arabia, and evidence in particular for the presence of Christianity there at the time of Islam's rise. This image up here is all the rage right now on social media. Just found it's not super close to Mecca. It's over in the Arabian or Persian Gulf on an island there, which is another island. There's a couple of these which has been found to have had a Christian presence. I think this island was abandoned by the 8th century, but it was there at the time of Islam's rise. This would have been a sort of a plaque which should have been mounted on the wall of a church. there. I've got this quotation there from Surah An-Nahl, which speaks about someone who was suspected of giving information to the Prophet. His speech is said to be Ajami, barbarous. I mean, I think that means a non-Arabic speech, so it is a sign of bilingualism within the Quran's context. I'm not, the Quran, of course, refutes the claim. I'm not like making an argument that, oh, this is a true source of the Quran or something. I'm only interested in this because of the indication of bilingualism. And that's interesting because if that other language, the Hajami or barbarous language, what would that be? Well, almost undoubtedly Aramaic because, well, the whole Nabatean realm, which includes what is now northern Saudi Arabia, was bilingual Aramaic, Arabic bilingualism, and the sort of Aramaic that was there was a Christian Aramaic. So also that bilingualism comes with some Christian baggage. Okay, we also have evidence of bilingualism. Now, this is actually very early. It's third century, so I mean, it would have only increased through the years. But here's an inscription studied by Ahmed al-Jalad there, where you can see everything in bold are Aramaic words. And everything that's not in bold are Arabic words. So instead of bint, we have BRT for daughter, and I mean, so on and so forth. Instead of Rab in line 7, you have Mar for Lord, those sorts of things. So that's really interesting. There is good reason to think that Quran 16, the verse we're just looking at, is really reflecting what had existed for centuries, which is bilingualism in Arabia. Also, we have more and more inscriptions, which, I'll speak about this in a moment, we can call Paleo-Arabic in terms of both their script and their language, which are explicitly monotheistic, and in certain cases, like this one from the 6th century, so less than 100 years before, I mean, really, if we take the beginning of the traditional date of the beginning of Muhammad's proclamations, just 60 years earlier, you have this, this is in northern Arabia in Duma, so not right next to Mecca, fair enough. But you have this monotheistic inscription, and then at the end, sensationally, this is Layla Namni studied this or published on it, you have a Christian cross. So we know what kind of monotheist this person was. It was a Christian. So super interesting. We have real evidence of Christianity among Arabic speakers and folks who were writing in this Paleo-Arabic script. By the way, in the book, I go into a lot more of these. I go into lots of different recent inscriptions or recent studies on inscriptions about monotheism. So chapter 3 really gets into detail. We'll give you a lot of intriguing information, evidence that, you can push back if you don't like my interpretation of it. Be happy to hear that. Or talk amongst yourselves. Here's a really amazing study. Again, Ahmed al-Jalad wrote on this in JSAI, really intriguing. His take is particularly intriguing. Originally published in Arabic by two scholars, Al-Hajj and Faqas, in Naqsh Jabal Zabub. This is a similar time to the inscription we just saw, but now we're talking about South Arabia, so not Paleo-Arabic, one of the South Arabian scripts. The language is a bit different too because it's close to ancient South Arabian, but has certain Arabic features. Anyway, the inscription begins with something that seems to be like the Basmala. Remember the Quran, most of its chapters, well, all but one, start with Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. And you seem to have that in the 6th century, so 100 years before the Quran, more or less, you seem to have this Basmala, tripartite proclamation. Now, actually, Ahmed al-Jalad argues a bit differently, and the translation reflects his interpretation. He makes it bipartite in the name of God, the Rahman. And the point there is to say that Allah is Ar-Rahman. And the Quran itself, in different places, says call on him as Allah or call on him as Ar-Rahman. Both are good, right? So it's doing something that the Quran itself would do a few decades later. The language is just so monotheistic. All of this, have mercy upon us, Lord of the heavens, Rabb as-samawat. Satisfy us, that's very Quranic language. Like, look at these roots, so Quranic. Razaqa, Rahman, Rahim, Rahma, Fadl, super Yom, you can see the word Yom there, etc., etc. Okay, so all sorts of things are going on, which lead to a clear conclusion for the northern portions of the Arabian Peninsula, that there was a revolution among the Arabic speakers there about 100 years, maybe 150 years before the revolution of Islam. What was that revolution? Up until this point, so up until the late 5th century in northern Arabia, there was a wide series of different scripts and dialects that were used, all of which are broadly within the family of Arabic. But by the year 500, all of those scripts disappear from the record of inscriptions, and instead we now have the Paleo-Arabic script being used for all of the subsequent inscriptions. Wait, there's more. All of the subsequent inscriptions are either explicitly monotheistic or at least not explicitly pagan or polytheistic. We have they disappear. There's no more polytheism in the inscriptions. So all this goes together, right? The unification of the script is a little bit more complicated, but maybe the unification of the language, but definitely the transition from polytheistic inscriptions with multiple gods and goddesses to monotheistic inscriptions. Robert Hoyland says, it was an idea whose time had come, and he means thereby the use of the Paleo-Arabic script. Jaled, there you go. He pushes it even further back, and he knows better than I do. By the 4th century, references to the pagan gods disappear almost entirely. So that's the south of the Arabian Peninsula. Okay, so just to be clear about that, there he's speaking of the south. But then when he goes to the north, he says by the 6th century, that is by 500, the pagan gods had completely disappeared from the inscriptions of North Arabia. I mean, this is pretty massive stuff. Pretty amazing. Okay, so many inscriptions have been studied now. I mean, some cool ones are the recent studies of Ahmad al-Jalad and Haytham Sidqi, for example, at Zalala, very, very, very close to Mecca. Friends, 75 kilometers. I mean, yeah, okay, they have cars or planes or whatever, but it's right on the path that takes you to Mecca where this inscription was found. For example, it's a common way from Ta'if to Mecca, Zalala. It's a monotheistic inscription. They're using monotheistic language, these roots like Baraka or Barak, Rab, all of this. So, yeah, super interesting stuff. The inscriptional evidence is matching what we find in the Quran. And what we find in the Quran is not only turns of phrase that are connected to the Bible or stories that were told among Christians, but references to living actual Christian communities around the Quranic author. Look at Quran 22:40. Had God not driven back the people, some by the means of others, there had been destroyed cloisters. Not sure if cloisters is the right word there, but let's just roll with it. Sawame, and churches, bi'a, oratories. I like that translation. Salawats. That word sometimes translated synagogues, but there's no reason really to translate it as synagogue unless you're just really convinced by stories of Jews in Medina, and mosques, places of prostration maybe, wherein God's name is much mentioned. That's cool, right? Because it's positive about all of the monotheists, but there's 2 or maybe 3 explicit mentions to Christian communities and a concern that some of them might have been destroyed. I mean, I don't want to get into something that might get a bit sensitive, but it is ironic that we have these reports, usually associated with the second caliph, Umar, of sort of cleansing Arabia from, Jazirat al-Arab, Arabia from Christianity and Judaism, when the Quran itself actually seems to be concerned that Christian buildings like Sawama and Bia and maybe Salawat should not be destroyed. Did I say that? Is concerned that they may be destroyed and argues that they should not be destroyed. Hopefully that point was clear enough. And that really the point. The point instead is to make an argument about Christianity as a conversation partner in the Quran. There are these bits, the Lebanese scholar Mahmoud Ayoub wrote an interesting article, which I mentioned here in the book, where he picks up on some of these. Amazingly, a lot of people haven't followed or haven't caught on or never read his work on this bit. But, maybe the most famous verse in the Quran is a light verse, and it's here, Quran 24:35. Allahu nur as-samawati wal ard, mathalu nurihi kamishkatin fiha misbah, etc., etc. God is the light of the heavens and the earth. The likeness of his light is as a niche, wherein is a lamp, etc., etc. So this is intriguing, right? There are biblical connections here with some Old Testament material, but there's also this image of a lamp. Okay, why is this interesting? A lamp. Well, read a little bit more. People stop at the end of verse 35, tend not to read 36 and 37, at least, scholars. Literally verse 36 continues the thought, right? Biyutin adhin Allah an turfa, etc., etc. In. So it starts with a preposition. It's not a new sentence. It's part of the same sentence. Yeah. So this light, or maybe this lamp, or maybe more sort of spiritually, this oil of a blessed tree, this fire, it is found in temples, which God is allowed to be raised up, where his name is commemorated mornings and evenings. And then look at verse 37. By whom? By men who are not distracted by commerce or trafficking or whatever. Like selling and tijara business. Okay. Yeah, it's super interesting, right? Seems to be a very positive affirmation of Christian communities, particularly monks who devote their whole life to the contemplation of God, not to tijara, not to working, something like that. Okay, there are other verses which are negative about ruhban, monks, and the rahbaniya may be saying it's invented, but that's okay. It's not the only place where we have an internal tension in a book. Okay, finally, if you're with me thus far, part one has been about the old style of saying Quran, like, its author met a few Christians, no big deal, maybe heretics. The second part was the Quran itself has lots of evidence about a robust engagement with the Christian culture. The third part is more and more material evidence, inscriptions and things are showing that Christianity really was there. That confirms what we're actually finding in the Quran. So what does this mean for the way we read the Quran? Well, the basic argument of the book is that even in places where the Quran is not explicitly mentioning Nasara, Christians, or Isa bin Maryam, Jesus, the son of Mary, or Injil, the revelation associated with Jesus, in other places too, basically everywhere, the Quran is in conversation with Christianity. Why? I should record a separate video on this too. But, briefly, because the Quran needed to make space for a new prophet. In the context of late antiquity, Christianity was everywhere. There was Judaism as well. Both communities agreed basically that prophets, the age of prophets, unless Christians would say, within the church, those who proclaimed in a powerful way the gospel, but prophets who would bring some new dispensation of a new sort of supernatural revelation, that age was over. And that was, everyone agreed on this. And so the Quran needed to make space for its own prophet. It needed to do something with Christian material, Christian traditions, and Christian claims. Okay, so one interesting way in which the Quran does something is to say, you Christians, you speak all the time about Jesus and his parables. Parable of the Good Samaritan, the parable of the prodigal son. You just always speak about them. And then your gospel has this thing where Jesus is like making it a big deal that the way he communicates is in parables. Even sort of enigmatically, he says, seeing they do not see, and hearing they do not hear. That is, through his parables, that's the effect. That it has this, generates this enigma in the way that they are receiving his message. Scholars of the New Testament and spiritual Christians have all sorts of thoughts about this and how parables reflect the work of the prophets and how they indicate sort of a spiritual dimension which supersedes human logic, stuff like that. Okay, but the Quran says very explicitly that God speaks in parables. So Allah, like Yeshua or Jesus, speaks in parables. We were just speaking about the light verse, Quran 24:35. Well, this verse gives a parable for God, makes him light, connects the light to a lamp, something about a tree, and all of this, all sort of enigmatic. But then it actually says, I didn't have to say this, could just give the parable. But then it says, God strikes similitudes, that's amthal, parables, for men. Just like Jesus tells a parable, then folks come in, why do you speak in parables? And then it does so. And then even more intriguing, Quran chapter 2, verse 26, the Quran seems to defend and in a way celebrate the parable telling of Allah. Allah does not shy away from presenting a parable of a gnat, ba'uda, something very small, like a really small thing, or something above it. And again, there's something about God does this to sort of confound people who do not have a generous, open heart. The folks who disbelieve, they say, what did Allah mean by this parable? Well, through the parable, just like, remember what Jesus said? Seeing they do not see. In Arabic, yudillu bihi. So God misleads the wrongdoers through parables. Very, very close to Jesus. Now, it's just the point here is not to say the Quran's copying for Jesus because they're not telling the same parables. The parables are different. The point is, one, that parable telling was a sign of spiritual power and charisma and authority among Christians. And two, isn't it interesting that the Quran makes a choice to make Allah a parable teller? The Quran's author makes Allah a parable teller. It's particularly among Christians. There's some of this in the Talmud and some Jewish traditions as well, but particularly among Christians where parables are so closely associated with Jesus. Okay, there we go. So, just a couple other examples of what the Quran is doing in places that are not explicit engagements with Christianity that shows Christianity as a conversation partner. Let's take Surah al-Fatiha, so the first surah of the Quran. Well, the Fatiha itself, there's a little bit of dispute about how to think of the first verse, which is in the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. And it's actually numbered, whereas in other surahs it isn't, except for the letter, which appears with Solomon and the Queen of Sheba later on. It's just interesting that we have this Basmala, which is tripartite. That is, it has these three parts. This came up in the inscription, and Ahmad Dajalat has written on this. But Allah, Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim. This three-part. Now, I'm not saying theologically they're the same, and they're not the same. Christian teaching on the Trinity, God as Father, Son, and Spirit, and what the Quran is doing with Allah, Rahman, Rahim. Some Christians, like Paul of Antioch, did argue that they're basically the same. But could it be that the Quran was used to Christians speaking in this way, possibly in sacramental or liturgical settings, particularly in baptism, because Christ at the end of the Gospel of Matthew commands his apostles to baptize people in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And, could it be that that language in a real lived Christian way was sort of everywhere, and the Quran does something similar but distinct with the Basmala? And then one more thing about Quran 1. At the end of that opening surah, that's just 7 verses, it refers to other groups. It refers to 2 other groups explicitly. 3 maybe. Guide us in the path of those you have blessed, maybe 1, and then not those you're angry with, and not those who are astray. Now, a lot of traditional Muslim scholars, Ibn Jawzi and others, have said there are allusions to Jews and Christians here. Famously, sort of, The Mohsen Khan, those are two different scholars, one Moroccan, one Afghani, I think. They translate this and render this in English by adding parenthetical comments in their translation to Jews and Christians because that's there in the tafsir or the medieval Islamic interpretations. A lot of people have been like, oh, Mohsen Khan, this was terrible. Like, you're creating enmity or you're polemical against Jews and Christians. But I mean, it's not a crazy idea how the medieval Muslims read this. I think it's probably right, actually. If you look at the association between the Israelites or Jews and ghadab, the word here is maghdub in Al-Fatiha. If you look at anger and the Israelites, they're often connected in the Quran. So it make a lot of sense that this is not just a vague reference to people God doesn't like. It's a specific reference to the Jews. And also, for the ones who are in error, in dal, that would be a reference to the Christians. So maybe even the Fatiha in its first verse and its last two verses is referring to Jews and Christians. Yeah, and then, isn't it intriguing that Jesus, and in a way, only Jesus, or Jesus above all, is employed in the Quran, among the pre-Muhammadan prophets. Jesus is above all employed to not only proclaim what the Quran and Quran's author teaches about God and about Muhammad, because remember, Quran 61:6, he will proclaim or predict that a new prophet will come named Ahmed, probably Muhammad. He does both. Jesus becomes the spokesman for the Quran's teaching on God and Muhammad. The Quran doesn't do this really with, Shu'aib. I mean, it does it a bit with Abraham in Al-Baqarah, where it speaks about, they prayed that a new prophet would come from this community, but nothing as sort of stunning as these passages. Here, Quran 5:117, Al-Ma'idah, it's either after Jesus goes to heaven, like right after, or maybe it's at the day of judgment or something. God questions Jesus and he responds to them, I only said to them what you commanded me to say to them. Serve God, my Lord and your Lord. I was a witness among them while I remained among them, but when you took me to thyself, lama tuwafaytani, then you were the watcher over them. You are a witness of everything. I mean, this is almost like a sort of exemplary manifestation of the proper disposition of a slave of God or a servant of God. So the Quran is putting forward a distinct image of Jesus, which reflects its own teaching about God and humanity, the transcendence or otherness of God and humans as his ibad, servants or slaves. And then, as I mentioned, Quran 61:6, basically Jesus is employed to predict the coming of Muhammad. The word Ahmed kind of complicates things a little bit. But why would the Quran? By the way, Jesus doesn't do too much other than this. Even Quran 19, he says, Ana Abdullah, I am the servant of God. I mean, that's not like the first thing he says as a newborn when he speaks. The miracles, they're reported and immediately says, by God's permission. I mean, everything almost everything in the Jesus material in the Quran is a sort of response to Christian claims. There's a real concern. For example, Christians tell the story, we know this from apocryphal gospels, of Jesus creating a bird from clay, bringing it to life with his breath. The Quran mentions this miracle, uses the verb khalaqa, which is interesting, but then it says, bi'idhnillah. He does this by the permission of God. So it's like defanging the argument Christians are making with these stories about the divinity of Christ, who acts like God does in the creation of Adam. Jesus does it with a bird. It defangs that story by saying, bi'idhnillah. Why would it do that? Why would it repeat that story? There's so many other Jesus miracle stories in the canonical Gospels. Well, undoubtedly, because there are Christians in its context advancing these sort of miracle stories to make their case for Jesus' divinity. Christians were around in the context of the Quran.
Okay, kind of one point. We're almost at the end, so congratulations if you're still watching. This is really interesting. When you read a text, one should be attentive not only to the authors, who the author was, and what was the author's, I don't know, personal history, background, ideas or whatever, what kind of mood was the author in, or this or that, linguistic skills, literary style, but also of the author's intended audience. So there's a quotation about, from a book about the fourth gospel, John, how important it is to know what was the community, the more Hellenistic community vis-a-vis the synoptic gospels. So too with the Quran, the time has come that we are attentive to the importance of the Christians in the context of the Quran, with whom the Quran is engaging, and Christianity as a conversation partner. Okay, so thank you so much if you're still here. Thank you, for being part of this YouTube community. By the way, there are memberships now, so I'd be really honored if you could support the work by joining. There's two different tiers. You can join as an explorer. That's super cheap. And there's some good perks with that. And then if you really want to support the work here, which is pretty unique because there's so much crazy stuff out there on religion on YouTube, then you could join as a visionary. And also, there's the book. Oh, there's my dog, Arrow. But there's the book, Christianity and the Quran. I'd be so grateful if you could spread the news. September 2nd, 2025. It's available to purchase online. Friends, really glad, and grateful to all of the people who supported me in the working, all the work that went into this book. I am just a little guy on the shoulders of giants. Thanks, friends, for being with me for this video, and bye-bye.